So it's my pleasure to introduce Logan Grady as he gives his master's thesis defense. Logan graduated from UC Santa Cruz in 2020 with a BS in environmental sciences, and he was and still is a keen scientific diver and analyst of ocean data at that point. He'd already been using satellite data to track marine heat waves, and when he came to visit the lab as a prospective student, I showed him some of the instrumentation in the lab and told him about the work by a student named Steve Cunningham, who had been conducting research on turbulence in a kelp forest called Stillwater Cove, and I could see then that Logan was really interested in pursuing this problem. So Logan designed and led this project. He applied for and received several grants to support the fieldwork, including a Myers Trust Grant, a Coast Award, and a Simpkins Family Marine Sciences Award. And he coordinated with marine ops and student divers to carry out a really ambitious project on a difficult problem of measuring ocean turbulence in the field, which requires a lot of care both in the field and on the data analysis side. In addition to being an expert in ocean mixing, Logan is also an expert marine ocean mixologist, which is related but different. As part of an outreach assignment for one of our seminar classes, he put together a series of adult and kid-friendly drink recipes to demonstrate concepts like stratification and turbulence. And many of you who have taken physical oceanography know that he applied those skills well in setting up laboratory demonstrations and explaining difficult concepts in a hands-on way. So without further ado, I'll let Logan present his work.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, everybody, for joining me this afternoon as I go over my thesis project, Observations of Currents, Waves, and Turbulence, all within a giant kelp forest in Stillwater Cove, Carmel, California. And so first, I want to just briefly go over the importance of kelp from a variety of different perspectives. And first and foremost, giant kelp is a foundation species, and this means that it physically creates the habitat that supports diverse communities of marine life all along the West Coast. And it's because of this that giant kelp is a vital resource for our fisheries and a growing aquaculture industry that generates tens of billions of dollars in revenue. But other than the ecological and economic impacts, it's also very unique to us physical oceanographers because giant kelp is very heavily intertwined with the surrounding physical processes that act around it. And then conversely, giant kelp forests also generate very unique patterns of flow that are unique to the nearshore environment and we don't typically see in open water. It's first, how does the flow of water affect the kelp forest? And first, nutrients are brought into these systems via internal waves and currents. And then once the nutrients are within the system, processes like surface waves and turbulent flow drive the circulation of nutrients and also the uptake of the nutrients by the kelp plants themselves. And then going more to the supply side, it's turbulent flow that actually influences the dispersal of sediments and propagules and the settling rate of these things as well once inside the forest. Ooh. And then on the flip side, the kelp also has a profound effect on the flow. And this is due to its horizontal and vertical structure. And so I have this diagram here, and at the forest level of processes where we're talking about an entire forest, they have this unique horizontal and vertical structure that creates a region of enhanced drag. And when I say drag, that just means the resistance to the flow force. And it's because of this drag that currents, as they move towards the kelp forest, are actually diverted around the edges. And for water that flows into the forest, it is attenuated or slowed down. And the reason for this enhanced drag becomes apparent when we zoom in on the kelp level processes, so focusing on an individual plant. And this is because as flow moves around a sporophyte or a kelp plant, it is diverted around the plant and loses a lot of energy and momentum and can be turned into turbulent flow, which is this kelp wake turbulence that I've labeled here. And if this is powerful enough, it can generate mixing behind the plant. And so turbulence is a very important process for this project, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. And so I just want to quickly go over what it is, why it's important, and how we measure it. And so here I have a stratified cup of coffee. I have warm caffeinated coffee on top, and then cold sweetened cream on the bottom. And I need nutrients from both of these to enjoy my morning cup of coffee. So I use a stirring stick. And when I move the stick through the fluid, it creates a relative motion around the stirring stick. And if I do this rigorously for enough time, it actually mixes the fluid in its wake, giving me both caffeinated and sweet enough coffee to be able to enjoy. And the same concept of mixing applies to nearshore ecosystems as well, which can rely on mixing in order to get their nutrients distributed both laterally and throughout the water column. So now moving on to how do we measure this sort of thing, starting with kelp wake. And kelp wake, the intensity of kelp wake is measured through a metric called the Reynolds number. And I have the equation for the Reynolds number here. And all you need to know about it is that a bigger diameter of object with a faster current moving around the object means more turbulent wake, or a higher Reynolds number. And turbulent flow typically occurs when Reynolds number is greater than or at about 1,000. And so in this diagram here, I have low Reynolds numbers less than 1,000 on top, and you can see that flow is pretty stable or laminar as it moves around the object. And then once we get into the range of about 1,000, it starts to become more chaotic and turbulent. And this is what can actually induce mixing if it's powerful enough. Next, we can have turbulence driven by shear. And shear just effectively means the friction between two layers of water moving at opposing velocities or different velocities. And so here in this diagram, I have light water sitting on top moving at a faster speed, and then dense water on the bottom moving at a slower speed. And the way that we determine turbulence via shear is through the Richardson number. And turbulence is possible from shear when the Richardson number is less than 0.25. And so we're actually looking for a smaller Richardson number. And what it looks like when the shear is able to overcome the density stratification of the water is we get these swirling eddies that form. And once the eddies start to get going and they're overturning the water, you start to get this chaotic motion around them where it dissipates and dissipates into smaller and smaller eddies. Now, Richardson number and Reynolds number are great as indicators of whether turbulence is happening via wake or shear, but they don't tell us a whole lot about the energy actually being expended from turbulence. And so the question becomes, how do you quantify something this chaotic? And so that's where I use turbulence dissipation rate. And here, to demonstrate what it is, I have a plot of velocity energy on the y-axis, and then frequency, or the time scale, on the x-axis. And for reference, I have tides in the top left here. So a low-frequency event happening once or twice a day, but very, very high velocity energy. They're moving a lot of water. Moving upwards, next we have internal waves, which happening on a much higher frequency, about every few minutes to every few hours, but less energy than tides. Then we have surface waves, which are very energetic. We can surf on these, and they're happening on the scale of 5 to about 20 seconds. And once we get beyond surface waves, we start to get to very, very small processes we can't really identify with our own eyes. And so here I have an example of a turbulent eddy motion, like we saw in the previous slide. And as we get higher and higher in frequency, the eddies start to generate smaller and smaller and smaller eddies. And it's this dissipation of the eddy energy that we're actually keeping track of here. And while this seems chaotic, like it did in the last slide, previous studies show that this cascade of energy, or this dissipation, happens at a rate of about -5/3. And it's in this range at high frequency with -5/3 that we have the inertial subrange. And so it's this inertial subrange, this whole range, that I'm actually keeping track of. And when I say high turbulence dissipation rate, this range is shifted upwards and generally more broad. And when I say low turbulence dissipation, it's shrunk down and a bit smaller of a range. And I'm going to be referring to it as dissipation rate or turbulence kind of throughout the rest of the presentation. And so now that we know a bit about turbulence, what it is, how we measure it, what previous studies have been done within kelp forests? And the answer is actually not a whole lot. One of the most comprehensive studies was done in a laboratory setting with model kelp in a flume, which is just a big channel of water they can shoot currents through. And this is actually a picture of that model kelp forest from the study. And so you can see much smaller than a real kelp forest. And what they found when they shot currents through this forest is that it enhanced turbulent energy from the wake of kelp, but the resulting eddies were still a bit too small and weak to actually mix the water efficiently. So then they tried shooting surface waves through it. And surface waves are unique because they're undampened by, or minimally dampened by the presence of kelp. So different from currents in that way. And they were able to enhance the turbulent energy further still, but not really efficient at mixing. And so this is kind of our baseline for what turbulence does when in a kelp forest. But this lab study is limited by the fact that they were using smaller kelp and reduced currents and surface waves. And so the Reynolds number, going back to that value, was actually around 500 for this study, which is not at that 1,000 or greater threshold we were talking about before. And since this study, there haven't really been field studies to verify the information that was found here. And in a natural forest, you can have Reynolds numbers on the scale of thousands to tens of thousands, so much more turbulent flow. What has been done in the field is looking at shear-driven turbulence. And so here I have a plot of Richardson number. Wherever you see black shading indicates shear-driven turbulence, where it was subcritical Richardson, so lower than 0.25. And you can see that it's pretty common throughout the water column during the whole time of the study. Now go to this bottom plot without kelp, and you can see that it's extremely rare. There's almost no shear-driven turbulence going on throughout the whole experiment. And this is due to that enhanced drag effect. Slower currents means less shear means there's not as much energy to overturn the stratification of the water column. Now the caveat with this is it was actually done in natural bridges and hasn't really been replicated in another forest. And so where does my study fit into all of this? First question I want to know is, can kelp within a natural forest produce fully turbulent wake? And I'm predicting that in a site, I think Reynolds number will not only be greater than 500, like in the lab, but it will consistently be above 1,000, so fully turbulent flow. Next, I want to know how likely shear-driven turbulence is within a natural kelp forest. And I'm actually siding with the previous field studies here. I think shear is going to be pretty rare because we're going to have reduced currents, and Richardson will rarely go below that threshold. And then finally, I want to know the physical processes that drive turbulence dissipation rate within a kelp forest. And I think that it's going to be positively correlated with larger surface waves, faster wave orbital velocities, and a faster current velocity. So now, how do I actually measure all of this stuff? There's a lot that goes into studying turbulence, and part of that is knowing what's happening around Stillwater Cove and in Stillwater Cove at the same time. And so on the left here, I have a map of Greater Monterey Bay. Each of these little red dots is an offshore buoy or mooring, and I use these to get offshore temperature, wind, and surface wave data. And then I also have a black arrow here indicating the direction of upwelling favorable wind, which can tell me a little bit about what kinds of water is moving into and out of the system from offshore during upwelling. And then this box is my site, Stillwater Cove. And I have it zoomed in here on this map. This yellow star is where I put the mooring, right in a kelp forest at the mouth of Stillwater Cove, which is this right embayment here. And the other features I want to point out are these white arrows. These indicate the current components, or the primary current components. And the main one I'm going to be focusing on is this U component here. And this pertains to flow going into and out of Stillwater Cove, and effectively my kelp forest. And then the final feature is if you follow these bathymetry contours of depth, you see this sudden decline in depth right in the bottom left, and that is actually the head of the Carmel submarine canyon. And this is an important source of cold, deep water from offshore that can get brought into Carmel Bay. That will become important in a few slides. So this is actually taken from my site. You can see that we're well within the kelp canopy of Stillwater Cove. There's the Pescadero rocks that separates the two embayments. This forest was about 200 meters across the mouth of Stillwater Cove, and then about 300 meters into the bay. To the left of where this picture was taken are the shallower wash rocks of Arrowhead Point, and these protect the site from some of the smaller waves and also keep it relatively low flow, or still water. And then the depth ranges from about 9 to 11 meters depending on the tides. So this is the design of my mooring that I actually threw in there. It started throwing in this central weight as the baseline for everything to be deployed out of. I have a taut line of temperature loggers here kept upright by a subsurface buoy, and this gives me temperature and density profiles. Next is an acoustic Doppler current profiler, or ADCP. And this gives me current velocity profiles, or velocity at multiple points throughout the whole water column. And then finally, I have the acoustic Doppler velocimeter, or the ADV. And this records water velocity and pressure at very high frequency of about 32 hertz throughout this study. And this allows me to record turbulence, dissipation rate at the high frequencies, as well as surface waves, which are happening about every 5 to 20 seconds. And then supplementing the instrument data, I also did weekly Kelp surveys. Each survey consisted of 8 4x10 meter transects run in half cardinal directions, so every 45 degrees. And along each transect, I measured the distance of kelp plants and stipe bundles along each transect, and then also their diameter at 1 meter off the seafloor. And this was only done for Macrocystis pyrifera, so giant kelp. There was bull kelp and pterogophora present on the outskirts of the site, but I tried to put the instruments farther away from those kelps to avoid interfering. Yes. And then finally, in addition to all the data and the instruments, I used my data to speculate on some mechanisms of turbulence using models. And the way these models are, I'm going to be comparing my data to them comparing models of bottom boundary turbulence and kelp wake turbulence to the data I actually find to make some speculations on the kinds of parameters that I see. So now, getting into the data, starting off broad. This is over my entire month-and-a-half long deployment, so 6 weeks. On the top, I have temperature. Temperature from the offshore buoys is in orange and blue, and then temperature from my site in Stillwater is in black. And then on the bottom here, I have offshore wind stress. And I want to point out this black line here, which indicates upwelling favorable wind wherever it's negative, which is pretty much the entire time. And so the first trend to point out here is on multi-day timescales, we can see that temperature really kind of fluctuates up and down. And this coincides with the upwelling favorable wind. So where we see the stronger wind means we see general cooling over the course of multiple days. And then when it starts to relax, it begins to warm. But when we zoom in to the scale, not just on multiple days, but happening every day, we can see that there are a whole lot of fluctuations happening. And these are actually caused by a semi-diurnal tidal frequency, internal wave that's oscillating between the Carmel submarine canyon and Stillwater Cove. And this is a major condition that I want to be keeping track of throughout my whole deployment. And so I want to actually focus and zoom in on the data that I collected. And this is what I'm calling full deployment 1. And this is just when all of my instruments were firing at the same time for the most comprehensive data set. So looking into full deployment 1, what do we have? This is a temperature profile that was recorded in the kelp forest. So this is from my mooring. Each of these dashed lines indicates a temperature contour. This one would be 13 degrees here and then 14 degrees. And then this solid black line is the tidal height of Stillwater Cove. And the first trend to point out is that we can see there's a bit of an upwelling relaxation event in the first half. Temperature rises and peaks, and then it starts to cool again during upwelling favorable winds happening. But in between that multi-day time scale, the temperature contours tend to fluctuate a lot. And this actually coincides with the tides. And so I have here marked in these blue shading regions what I'm calling cooling events. And for now, I'm just saying that whenever we have rising tides is where these events are, and we actually see the contours going up, which means colder water is taking up more of the space in the water column. And so cooling during rising tides. And then it tends to warm during ebb tides. Next, looking at the U component of velocity. And so wherever you see red indicates positive onshore velocity, and so water flowing into Stillwater Cove. And again, the big trend here is that wherever we see rising tide, where we get this cold water moving in, is also where we see the strongest onshore velocities. And then wherever we see blue, that's when water starts to flush out again. And the relationship or the trends here become more clear when we just isolate the bottom layer of velocity. And so this plot here shows the ADV and ADCP velocity from the bottom meter of water. And again, during those cooling events, we can see there are these massive increases in water flowing into Stillwater along the bottom. But then, during ebb tides, the water tends to flush out at a much more reduced rate. And so again, where these blue shaded regions are is what I'm calling cooling events, and that's just when the temperature in still water is simultaneously going down, but we have significant onshore velocity, or powerful onshore velocity. And so what's causing these events? I mentioned that they were tidal, but how do we actually know they're tidal? And so here I have a plot of energy for both pressure, which is basically sea level, velocity, and temperature, and then I have frequency on the x-axis here. And the main points to point out here is these energy peaks in all of the plots that happen at about 24 hours and 12 and a half hours. And these pertain to the diurnal and semi-diurnal tidal frequencies. And then there's a secondary, smaller peak that's insignificant, and this might be representative of infragravity waves or sea motion. It is noticeable on this plot, but it gets drowned out by those bigger tidal frequencies, and so I don't focus on it for this presentation. But it's these big peaks that tell us this is a tidal event that's happening. And more specifically, it appears to be an internal tide. And for those who might not be familiar with what an internal wave is, an internal tide is just a tidally forced internal wave. And so internal waves act just like surface waves do, but they happen below the surface between different layers of water density. And so here in this plot, we can imagine Carmel Submarine Canyon is deeper on the left, and then Stillwater Cove is shallower on the right, and the wave actually propagates up the coastline towards Stillwater Cove. And you can imagine this dark blue section as the cold water that's oscillating into the kelp. And then second, just to reinforce what we know about cooling events, what's actually happening when these events are happening. This plot on the top here is change in temperature over time, and then the x-axis is the change in sea level over time. And this red regression just shows that wherever we have a positive change in sea level is also where we see exponential cooling, and then vice versa when sea level starts to go down during ebb tides in Stillwater Cove. And then on this bottom plot, I have velocity profiles during cooling events and during normal conditions, or ebb tide. And during cooling events, we can see that we get a significant burst of onshore velocity rushing into the kelp forest at the bottom of the water column. But then during ebb tides, or normal conditions, we get a much less rapid flush of water out of the kelp forest. And this water is also warmer. So now we've gone over cooling events, but I'm also curious about waves, or surface waves coming in from offshore. So this top plot is wind stress, what we've seen before. Next is the offshore wave direction, so where the waves are coming from. I have wave period from this third plot, and the gold line represents Stillwater Cove. Significant wave height in Stillwater Cove is next. And the waves were actually smaller in Stillwater, so I've multiplied them by 10 just for this graph to show the trends more evenly. But this is more due to the fact that these are waves in the near shore, whereas offshore is in open ocean. And then finally on the bottom, I have the wave orbital velocity of Stillwater Cove. Now there's a lot of data up here, and so I just really want to focus on this section in particular. During this period of time, I have southerly waves coming in from offshore, so coming from about 180 degrees. And these are important because Stillwater Cove is a southward-facing bay, meaning that waves coming in from the south are less impeded by the geologic and geographic features around it when they're coming from the south. And it's during this time that we see the longest period swells in Stillwater Cove, and also the tallest waves coming into Stillwater. And the combination of these two factors mean that it's these southerly waves that also produce the fastest and most energetic wave orbitals, which is one of the things I'm looking at for turbulence. So, quick recap of everything. Stillwater Cove experiences a tidal internal wave, and this is likely originating from the Carmel Submarine Canyon. This internal wave, as it moves into the kelp forest, causes a cooling event, which is where colder water is rushed in with enhanced onshore velocity. After the event, the water warms and flushes out of Stillwater at a much more reduced velocity. And then finally, southerly waves are what generate the fastest wave orbitals going into Stillwater Cove. So now we know about the hydrodynamic conditions, both on broad scales, offshore, and within the kelp forest. What about the turbulence data? So getting into the meat of this all. I'm starting with shear-driven turbulence, so going back to this Richardson number variable here. This top plot indicates shear, and wherever you see a more red-shaded cell is where the highest shear is. This next plot in the middle here is buoyancy frequency, which is denoted by N. And buoyancy frequency is just the density stratification of the water column. Higher means more stratified, smaller is less stratified or more well mixed. This was derived from my temperature observations. And then finally on the bottom, I have Richardson number, so the whole metric of shear turbulence. And you might notice that, wherever there's a yellow cell indicates where shear-driven turbulence was actually possible. And you might notice that there's not a whole lot of yellow in this entire plot. And so shear-driven turbulence in my kelp forest was actually quite rare. And this was usually due to the fact that wherever we have these streaks of high shear also coincided with high buoyancy frequency. And so those two don't mix well to actually cause shear-driven turbulence. And so the instances of Richardson number being lower than the threshold were extremely rare. And the caveat with all this is my data is time averaged every hour, and this was to smooth over noise. However, even without this smoothing, it was still relatively rare, and so I don't anticipate that shear-driven turbulence is a primary mechanism for any sort of mixing or turbulent flow. Next is turbulence dissipation rate. And so I just want to quickly show what the data actually looks like to estimate this. Harkening back to that example graph from before, I have velocity energy on the y-axis, and then the frequency or the time scale on the x-axis. And if we follow this black line, we have the peak in surface waves up top here, and then this cascade of energy downwards as we get to about 1 second to a quarter of a second. And from this point, it's a computational process fitting this negative 5/3 slope to the spectrum beyond where we expect surface waves. And for this specific burst from the ADV, that best fit slope was right where this orange dashed line is. And so that indicates our range of turbulence dissipation rate. So now what does that actually look like? On this top plot, I have temperature from each individual logger. You can see the oscillations from the tides. Next, I have the velocity just from the ADV. The black line indicates the U component, so onshore versus offshore. And then on the bottom is kind of the crux of this whole experiment, really, is turbulence dissipation rate through time. And I've highlighted the burst that we just looked at here. It was burst number 76. And the primary trend that we see from these three variables is that during cooling events is also when we see these sharp increases in turbulence dissipation rate. But what's interesting is that the dissipation rate doesn't consistently fluctuate with temperature, stratification, or shear. The primary relationship is just between velocity, which is why I've included it up here. And then the final thing I want to point out is there are a lot of gaps in this dissipation time series that you may have noticed. And that's just because each data burst, like the one we saw before, goes through extensive quality control tests from several pieces of literature that have done this in the past. And a lot of the data just doesn't pass these tests, and so it ends up getting filtered out. But we still have enough here for a comprehensive timeline to compare to. And so because the primary relationship I saw was between dissipation rate and velocity, I plotted it out here. And so on the y-axis, I have dissipation rate, and on the x, I have that U component again. And to the right is onshore velocity. And the first thing I notice is that there's a very significant positive relationship between onshore velocity and dissipation rate. Great, that's kind of what I expected. However, on the other side, there is no significant relationship between offshore velocity and dissipation rate. And this is something that is kind of unique, and the best way I can describe it is that turbulence doesn't really care in an ideal environment which direction the water is flowing. It is more scalar, and so the higher velocity speed you have, the higher it could be. But the fact that we have two different relationships here, depending on the direction, implies that there's some external factor that may be influencing this. And so it's now time to dig into the actual kelp data. So here I have two of the weekly kelp surveys here. This red triangle indicates the central mooring weight that everything was based on. Each of these black lines is the transects that were run out. The blue square is the ADCP, and the orange X is the ADV. and the ADV and the ADV location doesn't change with the surveys. And then for reference here, the Carmel Canyon is directly about southwest from this location, just for reference, in the kelp forest. And immediately what I noticed looking through my different surveys is that where this blue square is has a much more consistently dense patch of kelp versus on the other side where this red square is. And this was consistent for all of the weekly kelp surveys. And so then I thought, which way is the current direction going? And so this green arrow here is the direction of cooling events, or when water's flowing into the kelp forest. And so immediately I noticed, oh, it's flowing directly through this dense patch before it hits the ADV. And so I'm calling this the flood quadrant. And then as water flows back the other direction, it's running through a much sparser patch, and I'm calling this the ebb quadrant because it happens during ebb tides. And so there's a strict density difference between these two sides, but is it actually producing any turbulent flow? So now checking the Reynolds number. On here is the stipe bundle diameter, or the diameter of each kelp plant I measured. The green is the stipes, or each of the individuals from the entire set of surveys. The blue bars are just from the flood quadrant, and then the orange bars are from the ebb quadrant. And then on this top x-axis, I have the distribution of Reynolds number. And what I've done here is I've just taken each of the stipe bundle diameters and applied a constant current of 0.7 centimeters a second, which is extremely slow, but it's actually the average current speed throughout Stillwater during my deployments. And then I've marked where this 1,000 value, or the critical threshold for turbulent Reynolds, is located. And you can see almost nothing is passing it. And so during ebb conditions, or this typical conditions in Stillwater, it's not actually producing a whole lot of turbulent flow. But the story changes during cooling events. Here, the average velocity dials up to about 2.5 centimeters a second. Still relatively slow, but a lot faster than the previous conditions. And now, the Reynolds number gets shifted much farther back, and this threshold is hitting a lot more of the kelp throughout my entire surveys. And more importantly, where these blue bars are indicates the flood quadrant. A significant number of the flood quadrant kelp is actually now exceeding that turbulent threshold. Whereas in the ebb quadrant, there's still nothing going over that 1,000 value. And so right off the bat, now there's a difference in the density and the ability to generate turbulence between these two directions about the ADV. And so just going over everything. Shear-driven turbulence is rare in Stillwater Cove, according to my data, and it's uncorrelated with dissipation rate. What turbulence is correlated with seems to be onshore velocity, but this is really only during cooling events and not so much as water flushes out of the kelp forest during ebb tide. This directional difference may be explained by some differences in the kelp density across the ADV, depending on where water's flowing. And this is supported by the fact that Reynolds numbers are above 1,000 during cooling events, but not so much as water flows back the other direction. So now moving on from all this data and all these lines and time series, what does it actually look like? How can we visualize what's happening? So here I have where it all starts, during low tide. And here I have a cross-section of Carmel Bay. The Stillwater Cove kelp forest is on the right in the shallows, and Carmel Submarine Canyon is on the left. And the dense cold water is oscillated into the canyon during low tide. Then during rising tide, that cold water oscillates out of the canyon and starts to move across Carmel Bay on the seafloor, where it's pushed down by the lighter water. And so I have here the motion of where it's moving directly towards our kelp forest. And so here on the left is the denser patch of kelp, the flood quadrant, right before hitting our ADV, and then the sparser ebb quadrant is on the right here. And the internal wave propagates through the kelp forest, bringing with it that enhanced velocity and the colder, denser water. And as it does so, it passes right through this dense patch of kelp. And as it moves around all of these plants, it's producing enhanced kelp wake turbulence. And our ADV may be in close proximity to this to actually record that. But in addition to the kelp wake, it's also passing over the rocky substrate that kelp needs in order to grow on, or to anchor to. And this causes its own bottom boundary layer turbulence off of this rough substrate. And our ADV might also be in close enough proximity to measure that. And then also, as the wave moves, it's generating turbulence at the front of the wave between the two layers of water. But as we saw with shear-driven turbulence, that didn't seem to be much of a factor. And then finally, as the wave now hits kind of the end of its oscillation and starts moving back the other direction during ebb tide, it comes back at a much more reduced velocity past this small and sparse kelp patch. And the smaller kelp, that sparser, produces less turbulent wake. And it also passes over a smoother part of the substrate with less rocks, and it's more sandy and gravelly. And this is producing less turbulence as well, which might explain why the ADV sees reduced turbulent dissipation. So now that we have this data with us, what can we actually do? And this is where the models come in. So this picture here kind of represents all the different processes that I think are the primary mechanisms of generating turbulence. And so I'm starting off here with a bottom boundary turbulence model. And I have the equation for it up here. And this epsilon value is my in situ data, and then this PS is my bottom boundary model. And we can sort of treat this like its own hypothesis, where we're assuming that the model is equal to my data, and I can use that to estimate parameters of bottom drag. And so from the model, I have current speed, which I've observed, the bed roughness, or the drag, which is what I'm going to model, this von Karman constant, which stays the same, and then the height off the bottom that I measured velocity, which is also observed. In addition to this model, I'm also testing for a model of submerged vegetation wake, which can be applied to giant kelp here. And this was used by NEP in 1999 to look at the wakes of submerged vegetation. And then the final thing is that these models start to get a bit skewed when the waves overpower the current. And so I'm filtering out all data with a wave to current ratio that's greater or equal than 2, meaning waves aren't completely overpowering the currents. And so here I've plotted the bottom boundary model, which is on the x-axis, and my data on the y-axis. And again, because I have all the different values except for bottom roughness, I can fit the bottom roughness that best represents my data. And so what I find is that we get a value, a bottom roughness of 0.1. What does that mean? This seems pretty arbitrary. Well, typically in the nearshore, when we're dealing with sandy bottoms or gravel bottoms, we get bottom roughnesses of around 0.003. And so we're a few orders of magnitude up from this value. But of course, we're not dealing with sandy bottom in a kelp forest. We're dealing with a rougher substrate. And what I've actually found is that it's a lot more similar in bottom roughness to an environment like coral reefs. And so this value of 0.1 is more in the range with what's experienced in a coral reef. And when you think about the kind of geometry of a coral reef versus a kelp forest, you can see a bit more similarities than with something like a sandy or gravel bottom. Next, testing this kelp wake turbulence model. The best drag coefficient, I should introduce the equation. So same thing applied here, but with this new equation, PW. This is also a function of current speed, a kelp drag coefficient, which is different than the bottom drag, and then this kelp spacing parameter, which I also observed from my distance measurements along the transect. And when I fit this model, I get a kelp drag coefficient of 4.1. And the kelp drag coefficient is usually on the order of magnitude of 1. And so this is still actually higher than what I expected. And this might be due to a few reasons. Previous kelp drag coefficients that were studied in laboratory settings are usually lower than this, but my kelp spacing is not a direct measurement of distance between two kelp plants. I wasn't getting the x and the y coordinates, essentially, of each kelp plant. It was more getting the spacing in a given area around my transect surveys, which may overestimate some of the kelp spacing and give us a higher drag. And next is that these models that I'm using assume that it's either fully kelp wake that's producing my turbulence or bottom drag that's producing my turbulence. Whereas in reality, as we saw with the visual representation, it's possibly both. Actually, it's most likely both, or other factors that not being taken into account. And both of these things in tandem might contribute to the fact that we're seeing higher drag coefficients here. But still, the fact that we actually have the data to fit to these models in the first place is something novel. And then finally, just addressing surface waves, which I originally thought were going to contribute to enhanced dissipation rate, but actually I found there was no correlation between turbulence and wave orbital velocity. What I did find, which I thought was interesting, is that I wasn't able to record any dissipation data during periods of low wave orbital velocities. And this was consistent around my entire project. And so, without any dissipation rate data during these periods of smaller wave orbitals, the results for that specific hypothesis are inconclusive for now. So finally, where does this land with all of my questions? First, does Kelp at my site have the capability of producing fully turbulent wake? The answer is yes, but only during the enhanced onshore velocities of cooling events. And during these times, the Reynolds numbers were about 500 to greater than 1,000, which is fully turbulent, but only during these events. Next, how likely is shear-driven turbulence at my site? I found that it was very rare, so very similar to the previous field studies that have been done. And it was also uncorrelated with dissipation rate. And so I'm still deeming that shear-driven turbulence is unlikely within a kelp forest. And then finally, what are the physical processes that drive dissipation? I found that it was significantly correlated with onshore velocity, but not offshore velocity. And so the fact that there's this directional factor indicates to me that it's actually the bottom boundary and kelp wake that seem to be the primary mechanisms, whereas velocity is kind of just the fuel for the fire. Now, what do I want people to take away from this? Well, first, studying turbulence is very, very difficult, and it's made even more difficult in the kelp forest thanks to variable kelp spacing, differing bathymetry, and then differing conditions depending on where you are in the forest. Stillwater Cove makes this even more challenging because it's a sheltered site. Velocities are very low, and it's sheltered from bigger waves. However, I was still able to record acceptable measurements of dissipation rate, which hasn't previously been done before. And with these results, I was able to speculate on models of bottom boundary and kelp wake, and can start to speculate on how these are primary mechanisms of generating turbulence, which leads into other factors like mixing and nutrient circulation. And on that note, processes like propagule and sediment dispersal, as well as nutrient circulation, count on turbulence. And previous studies of these have used or kind of modeled these processes using velocity or kelp diameter in the past. But what I find with my data is that the spacing of kelp and also the bottom boundary layer and the roughness of that bottom boundary layer are important factors as well. It's not just the velocity, but where the velocity is coming from and what it's passing through where you measure it. And then finally, in a future where ocean conditions are changing, understanding these mechanisms for generating turbulence is incredibly important for not only understanding the kelp forest, but for their future preservations as well. So just want to give some quick acknowledgments. As Tom had mentioned, I want to thank Coast and the Simpkins Family Marine Science Scholarships and the Earl and Ethel Myers Oceanographic Marine Biology Trust for helping to fund this project. They're what allowed me to actually go out and study this research, and without them I wouldn't have had the batteries to be out there for a month and a half. Next, personal acknowledgments. I want to thank the Stillwater Cove dive team for consistently going out there and helping me with this project, as well as Marine Ops for letting me go into the middle of a kelp forest and drop some stuff off and not hopefully get it tangled up in the kelp. Thank you guys. I could not have done it without your help. Next, I want to thank Tom. You pretty much ran a miniature lecture series with me on how to estimate dissipation rate in your spare time with our meetings, and it's transcended my time at Moss and given me skills that I'll use for the rest of my career. Next, I want to thank my family and friends, some of them in front of me here and then others on Zoom. Special mention for my mom and my dad. You guys were an amazing support network and always there for me through this whole entire process. And then finally, my partner Jeanette, who was always there to support me through the good times and the low times, and was kind of my rock all this pictures that you see up here happened during my thesis project, and it was a great way to escape from all of the academics. With that, thank you guys for sitting through all that. I think it's time for questions.
Questions in the room first, and we want to make sure that people on Zoom can hear, so I'll pass around the microphone. So any questions? Mike?
I gotta get up, or are you gonna bring it?
Bring it.
All right, Logan, it was awesome.
Oh, good.
Been looking forward to it. You may or may not know that within the state of California, there's a lot of pressure on harvesters for dealing with kelp. And one of the arguments people have been making against kelp harvesting, even though it's done at the surface, is that there's a physical effect to the habitat caused by some of the stuff you're talking about, right? So people are worried that if you do too much kelp harvesting, you're going to change the physical environment such that fish or other organisms respond differently. I took that as kind of a filter as I looked through your stuff, trying to see if there was any evidence, for example, during your cooling, high velocity periods, of evidence happening at the surface or not. And you didn't get much into the distance off the bottom, but can you help? Is there anything that you have that says whether this is primarily a benthic phenomenon, even if there's a kelp effect, or is there any evidence of something happening at the surface that could feed into this discussion?
Yeah. So the surface is a very unique environment of its own, even within the kelp forest, because the canopy is much denser and thicker up there. And my data, or any velocity data at the surface, is cut off because the ADCP, the acoustic beams, get blocked by the presence of kelp. And so on the very surface, I'm not actually collecting data, but in the benthic area, I think from what I see, it's pretty isolated in the benthic area, and the difference between the top is another area of study that needs to be looked at. But from this data, I would say it's inconclusive whether the surface affects the boundary layer at the bottom, but I think the two are relatively isolated. I think kind of just qualitatively, if kelp doesn't have kind of that surface anchor of drag, it might be a bit more, or I guess less resistant to flow and wave around a bit more. And so it might actually be less impeded by waves without that extra force up top, if I had to make a speculation on it.
So that means we have to get you in there while the kelp harvester is going above you.
Yeah, and I'd have to
avoiding your buoys and
I'd
bubbles.
have to figure out a way to put an ADV at the surface, which is, oh God.
Thank you, Logan. I learned so much, and I think I'm still processing and digesting. So I think I'll ask you to help me along on that process.
Sure.
I'm thinking about when kelp densities drop, like naturally in winter, right? Storms go up, but there's also a lot more wave energy, and generally warmer water, less upwelling. And then there might be something more like urchin barrens that we've been having, where this can happen during cooling periods. So what kinds of physical mechanisms do you think might weigh in more or less, I guess, in those different periods of kelp densities changing?
Yeah, so kind of on the physical side, I think when you have a healthy kelp forest like I had here in the summertime, definitely the internal tides coming in kind of dictated the hydrodynamic environment. They were very dominant. As soon as you get to winter, I shared a video by Roxy where the waves were actually cresting over the pier. So 10 to 20 foot swells, a bit higher than what I experienced at my time there. And once you transition to that kind of wave environment, I think the hydrodynamic conditions become a little less important, and it's more the kelp just trying to hang on. And then once you have kelp that's either ripped out from that environment and you have more of a barren region, I think it would start to transition more to what we're used to in the near shore, which is open water, and maybe you would have something like shear becoming important again because there's less drag to reduce the velocity. Again, I'm just measuring this over the course of a month and a half, and it was great for having a healthy summer kelp forest, but it would be interesting to see like the seasonal variability as the regime changes. But with my weekly kelp surveys over a month and a half, there wasn't a significant enough change in the density to really notice those kinds of processes. Yeah.
Neat, thank you. It sounds like there are a lot of interesting directions to take next.
Oh, yes.
Super cool, Logan. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about some kelp forests like down in the Channel Islands, where there can be much stronger, like tidally induced flow, particularly in the alongshore direction, and where the kelp will like lay down, and multiple meters during that really strong flow. So in that type of a kelp bed, do you think these turbulent forces are going to be much more important, or I guess influential to the dynamics?
Yeah, absolutely. And even in the previous study in natural bridges that I showed, their average current speed within the kelp was around like 5 to 6 centimeters a second, which is twice as fast as some of the strongest cooling events I experienced here. And so I think kind of taking what I've learned from this kelp forest and applying it to those, also where kelp has sometimes dozens to hundreds of stipes in some of these forests, the turbulent forces would be a lot stronger. Number one, you would see much stronger kelp wake, indicated by Reynolds number, which would be a lot higher. And I think you would also, because of that, see higher dissipation rates. And so higher velocity flow means there's more energy to be dissipated into turbulence and converted to mixing. Yeah, I would say that definitely trying it out in different kelp forests that aren't as sheltered as Stillwater would be a really good next step. And I'd be really curious to see if we get dissipation rates that are orders of magnitude higher than what I experienced in Stillwater. Yeah.
So I'll raise hand up first, and I'll come to that.
Great talk. You obviously put so much amazing time and effort into this. I wanted to ask about something that you maybe didn't spend as much time on, though. So you were talking sort of qualitatively about how the flood quadrant and the ebb quadrant, like the flood quadrant had more like rugosity or like more complex bottom surface, and then you were modeling like the bottom boundary layer and then also kelp. So do you think that someone who was trying to like take this in the next step could use some sort of like quantitative rugosity factor, and that could help like separate those two effects? Like, do you think that would be possible?
Well, that's a great question. Concerning the rugosity part, it was, because I was looking at this retroactively when I had the data.
Sure.
And so what I'm thinking of is kind of like the kelp transect surveys where it's the point and you get the rugosity measurement. I don't know if there's research out there that shows whether certain rugosity measurements and what metric compares to the drag coefficient, but how it's done typically in the nearshore is through fitting a logarithmic curve to your current profile, and based on the coefficients of that curve determines your drag parameter. And so there's a lot of assumptions and conditions that have to be just right to actually do that, and my kelp forest, instead of having a nice kind of line that we can fit to, it was more like a giant U shape at the bottom, and so I wasn't able to fit it that way. But it's definitely something I thought of where I was like, man, if I could just measure the shapes of the bottom boundary and get a drag coefficient to compare to, that'd be great. But for now, I think it's just a matter of trying it at different kelp forests and seeing how that data from different forests or different locations stacks up using the same method and what drag coefficients fit best in different parts. And then the other thing is with kelp spacing, you could absolutely do a more detailed measurement of kelp spacing. I designed this with the expectation that it was going to be 2 divers doing 8 transects with limited resources, and so my measurements were more rudimentary, and it was only after the fact that I realized, oh, if I had just gotten like a lateral measurement or something using arm length or something, it would have been a little more accurate. But the way I did it is still a legitimate way. It's just not as precise because we have to assume that kelp is uniformly spaced over a more broad area rather than, say, like measuring a specific dense patch that just happens to be within a greater 16-meter area. So I think it could be done in different locations. I don't know if you'd be able to parse out the 2 different processes, but
Yeah.
if you're measuring close to the bottom boundary layer, you're probably going to have bottom boundary turbulence affecting it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you were to do this study again, is there anything that you would add or do differently? Like, would you do it at a different site? Would you do it for longer? Are there any parameters that you didn't measure that you were hoping to measure?
Yeah, so kind of going back, I would get better estimates of kelp spacing and also maybe take note of the bottom boundary environment. But also, I think going back to what Scott was saying, testing it in a different environment, even like natural bridges, where you still have relatively flat shelves of mudstone and could put an ADV there, would be interesting because it's higher flow velocity and different diameters of kelp. And so trying it in a different forest, but also just using more ADVs, if you could get them, because I'm just putting an ADV in a single location over a long period of time, and that was kind of the control, was this consistent location. But having multiple measurements of kelp spacing, bottom roughness, and dissipation around a forest for multiple ADVs, I think could give a more comprehensive answer. And so that's probably where I'd start with improving, is more co-located measurements. Yeah.
If there aren't any more questions, let's give Logan a hand. Congratulations. So Logan is going to meet with his committee, but there are some snacks and pizza, and so we'll meet with Logan, and then Logan will come back out and be able to celebrate with everybody. So thank you.